Recording in progress.
And political changes. And the that recording is up at futureeducation.com. Every session has an MP3 recording and a full Illuminate recording. If this is your first time in Illuminate, it is a participative environment. We sure hope that you'll use the tools to communicate, including coming on and asking questions live, or you can ask them in the chat. You see the clapping hand at the bottom of the participant box, the smiley face. That larger icon with the green up arrow, the hand with the green up arrow, is how you would raise your hand to ask a question, and we'd give you the microphone. I'm going to suggest that you go up to View Layouts right now on your computer screen, View Layouts, and select the wide layout. With a good, healthy group here, the chat will get fast and furious, and it will make it easier to follow if you're in the wide layout. Okay, so now's your chance to tell us where you're participating from. Look for the wand. It's the wand with the red star at the end. If you click on that, and then you click on the map, it gives us a visual indicator. It looks like we have, of course, the United States, Mexico, Australia, China. Feel free to do a shout out in the chat. We'd love to know what the temperature is, what time of day it is for you. I'm coming live from Southern California, which is not my usual home, but I'm on a trip with my family. So I'm in gorgeous weather, but I won't tease anybody with it. Looks like Canada as well. Melbourne, welcome. Of course, wherever you're listening from, or if you're listening to the recording, we sure do appreciate your coming on the show. So Barry, you and I have a tie at Swarthmore College. I actually lived there for a few years as a child, and my father was in the administration there. I ended up going to Haverford College, a local arts college quite close to Swarthmore, with some small rivalry. So this is really fun for me to have you on, and I have to say I loved both the books, and I think they are going to provide us with a really rich discussion around two sort of themes that have been a part of the interview series. So thanks again for taking the time.
Again, you're very welcome. I'm eager to do this.
Okay, so I retitled our session when I went out to advertise it again today as Doing the Right Thing in an Institutional World. And it feels to me that what a lot of educators struggle with right now is figuring out how to define a path for themselves where they feel like they're doing the right thing for their students in an educational system that's increasingly trying to prescribe their behavior. The two books, and I'm hoping that you'll give us a short summary of each, but for me the two books encapsulate two of our recurring themes. The first one is having some understanding of how we respond cognitively in ways that often aren't productive in our current society. So that we have ways that sort of in our gut we feel are appropriate, or that something makes sense to us, but in fact turns out not to be sensible. And the second theme is understanding education in terms of what we've called institutional pathologies, ways in which institutions do the things that get them the opposite result of what they were instituted for. So could I get you to give a short introduction to the paradox of choice first, and kind of talk about how that came about and what the theme of the book is?
Certainly. The theme of the book is really to pick up on what I take to be the kind of unofficial ideology or implicit ideology of America and most of the industrialized West. And it runs roughly like this. Freedom is the highest good, and the more freedom people have, the better off they are. The way to enhance freedom is to give people choice. So the more choice people have, the more freedom they'll have, and the more freedom they have, the better off they are. And what the book is about is evidence that's accumulated in the last decade or so that that set of assumptions is false, in the sense that if people have too much choice, instead of being liberated by it, they're paralyzed. And we see this when people are looking for shampoo in the supermarket, and I think I see it when my graduating seniors at Swarthmore are trying to figure out what to do with their lives once they graduate. There aren't any constraints. Everything is possible, and when everything is possible, people don't know how to make decisions. and they either don't make them, or they make bad decisions, or if they make good decisions, they end up dissatisfied with them even though they shouldn't be, because they're imagining that some other decision would have worked out better. So that, in a very long paragraph, is what the book's about.
Is it fair to place the book within the context of Predictably Irrational and a number of these other books that sort of look at how our brains are developed and our cognitive capabilities, and where the sort of the complexities of our current world overtax us? Is it fair to put the book in that category?
Well, I think in some respects the answer to that is yes. So in part, what the book does is discuss 30 years of research that has made it quite clear that in general people make suboptimal decisions. People don't know how to think about uncertainty. People are heavily influenced by the way the options are described to them, so you can describe the same options in two different ways and people will make different decisions. People are very influenced by what you might call an anchor. If you see a suit in a department store for $1,200, suddenly an $800 suit looks like a bargain. And if the $1,200 suit hadn't been there, the $800 suit would have seemed outrageously expensive. So we have a whole bunch of cognitive shortcuts that mostly get us to the right place, but sometimes lead us astray. And the problem is that these shortcuts are not things that we decide to use. We use them automatically. And if we are unaware of their imperfections, we'll just use this shortcut, make a decision, and then later on regret it. So the rational tools that we are taught to use don't automatically get invoked to check up to make sure that our automatic answers are the right answers. So there's a lot of that that I talk about in the book, but the truth is that we are now so overloaded with information that even if we were essentially infallible cognitive creatures, we would not be able to handle all of the information processing that is necessary to make the decisions we face on a daily basis.
So to what degree do you think this confusion or the circumstance of too many choices, and you give some great examples and studies that show that the more samples that were available for people to taste, the more difficult it was to actually buy a product.
Yep.
And just terrific examples of how counterintuitively more choice leads to actual less action and happiness.
Mm-hmm.
How much do you think this is related to increased sophistication of marketing and financial imperatives that have led marketers to produce this dramatic quantity? You hear often of Procter & Gamble having multiple brands in order to capture more sales.
Well, I think
is that working or not?
I think the story there is mixed, and I'm not an expert on marketing, but sometimes the people who make products that end up on your supermarket shelves are proliferating brands because there's basically a real estate war going on, and I was oblivious to this when I wrote the book. If Coca-Cola has 8 different products, that means there's less shelf space for Pepsi products. And so one reason for proliferating brands is simply to capture shelf space. The second reason for proliferating brands is this kind of ideology that you want to have a product that will meet each and every human being's desires. And there's a kind of assumption that if you're happy, let's say, eating cornflakes every day, then you're indifferent to the fact that there are 200 alternatives. You don't care. You just go to the supermarket and you buy your cornflakes. And what difference does it make to you if there are 2 alternatives or 5 or 50? It doesn't matter. On the other hand, if I don't like cornflakes, having options will increase the chances that I'll find some kind of cereal that I do like. So the idea is that when you add options, you don't make anybody worse off, and you will make somebody better off. And that's a very reasonable way to think about it. What do you care what else is there as long as you're satisfied with cornflakes? As it turns out, however, when you add options, you do make people worse off because all of a sudden you start scratching your head and saying, well, maybe I don't want cornflakes. And then you start to look at the 200 alternatives, and you die of starvation before you pick a cereal. So I think it's motivated by a mixture of very logical thinking that turns out empirically to be false, and this kind of strategic war to capture space on the grocery shelves.
I really like that, and I'll add another piece to it that I've personally experienced, which is I have such difficulty figuring out the options for my own cell phone coverage, my carrier, that I can't even imagine comparing my cell phone provider with another provider.
And they don't make it easy for you.
Well, I've actually wondered if that wasn't intentional.
I think it is to some degree intentional. I think they want you to buy on the basis of the images that their advertising communicates rather than on real product differentiation. And so I think they deliberately obfuscate things that people would probably care about, so that side-by-side comparisons are essentially impossible to make. I don't think it's an accident.
I felt that way for cell phone coverage, that they're trying, that they reach my cognitive limit.
They reach everybody's cognitive limit.
And
just some people think they're masters of the universe, and whatever the world throws at them, they can handle, and they're wrong.
So I've seen that in healthcare as well. Again,
Yep.
It's sort of big purchase, big decision making, and then very big difficulty in comparing. So yeah, I think it does seem like that strategy. In the chat, Wendy is saying that she likes Trader Joe's for that reason.
Yep.
I don't know if you see Trader Joe's where you are.
Yeah. No. And Trader Joe's is a hugely successful chain, and people love it, and there's very limited choice. Another example is Costco, which manages to compete reasonably effectively against Walmart, although its prices are higher, partly because it actually pays decent wages, and again offers extremely limited selection. People walk out of Costco happier than they walk out of any other store. And even Procter & Gamble, learned this several years ago. They actually reduced the variety of things they offered in certain product categories. And Staples, I learned this. Staples is a huge, retail office supply place. They have a print catalog. I don't know if they still have it, but they did have it, and it mostly went to business offices. And it was, hundreds and hundreds of pages, and it cost a fortune to produce and to mail. So they decided that they would reduce the choice in many product categories just to save money on production costs of the catalog. And they assumed that they would lose sales, and because they were not offering certain products that people wanted. And what they found is that in every single category where they reduced options, sales went up. So there are examples out there in the real world where people reduce options for reasons that have nothing to do with my book, and they end up making more sales, not fewer, because they solve the problem for people.
Part of what I thought of when I thought of Costco, because I thought of Costco as well. I hadn't thought of Trader Joe's. Thanks, Wendy. But part of what Costco does for me is they actually I consciously am aware that they're making choices for me, and I trust them. So I delegate to Costco the research and the choice making, and then I trust them, and I feel comfortable with that. To me, like that fits very much with the theme of the book.
No, and I think actually one way out of this, no one's going to pass a law that says you can only have 50 kinds of cereal. So a way out of this is to find somebody to curate the choice set for you. You can use Consumer Reports. You can shop for clothes in a boutique instead of a massive department store. You usually pay a premium for that. But for a lot of people, it's a price worth paying because they make choosing less torture.
There was another theme that came up for me that was a little bit scary or was hard for me to figure out how to get a handle on. I used to go to a travel agent to book my travel. Now I book everything myself.
Mm-hmm.
And I happen to be a fairly savvy traveler, so I end up getting really good deals, and I feel like I kind of game the system. I'm a winner. But I feel like that's probably not the common experience. I mean, for every time I'm winning the game, I figure somebody's losing the game.
Mm-hmm.
And I've wondered about the implications of that for education, because it feels as though education is going to increasingly favor the autodidact, the person who can seek out information and work on their own? And does that have implications in terms of how we think about who wins and loses?
Well, that's a great point that I hadn't thought about. I think there's no doubt that you're right. I've thought about that in a slightly different context, and that is the increasing willingness of school districts basically to allow open enrollment. So wherever you live, you can get your kid into any school that you want in the entire district or the entire city. You know, there may be a waiting list, there may be a lottery, but whatever there is, you're not limited by your geographical location. And this has enormous benefits for the people who have the wherewithal to do the research, take time off from work, blah, 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 and seek out the best schools. And the people who are not in that position, which is to say probably the people whose kids most need the best schools, will end up in the worst schools, their neighborhood schools, which will get even worse because they will have been abandoned. And many people suffer, as in the financial collapse of the last 3 years. There may be a kind of effort to reclaim values other than financial success. But whether this effort lasts partly depends, I would think, on how long people's memories are and how long they have to suffer. You know, if we recover reasonably quickly and in another couple of years everybody is back where they were 5 or 6 years ago, I'm afraid the lesson of the wrongdoing of the last few years will be lost, and no sort of structural institutional changes will survive the calamity.
Before we move on to Practical Wisdom, second book, I wanted to ask you quickly about sort of the conclusions you draw in the Paradox of Choice. It feels very much like they're individual choices rather than larger systemic changes. Is that a fair characterization?
Absolutely. The book is really written for, basically what's your problem as an individual and what can you do about it. The one conclusion, though, that I think is a message to institutions is that people need constraints. People need to operate, what makes people free is choice within limits, not unlimited choice. And what that means if you're an institution is that opening up more and more options for the people who participate in who partake of the services you provide is not doing people a favor. So more particularly if you're an educational institution, a complete smorgasbord menu of things that people can study is not doing people a favor. It is abdicating responsibility. So if you're trying to design a curriculum for a school, and I think this is true of any level of education, the thing that you need to be asking is what is the kind of what's the kind of structure that allows people the kind of freedom that really is liberating without basically opening the door so wide that people don't know what direction to go in.
What
And
if the reason gets
in liberal arts colleges more get a piece of paper?
One of the guests we've had on the show recently was Kevin Kelly, who wrote a book called What Technology Wants. And he describes technology, or what he calls the techium, as this kind of force like nature that we're going to have to learn to deal with. And he uses the Amish as an example of a culture in which they figured out how to kind of filter and make decisions about their technologies rather than just using whatever comes along.
Mm-hmm.
And inherent in that, of course, are the willingness of a people to assent to a decision made by a religious leader. And, we may not have the benefit of that in a lot of places in which we're making decisions. But also inherent in that is a belief in the value of educating around the topic. So it felt to me very much like when I finished Paradox of Choice, that part of my conclusion was I really want to make sure I'm teaching my children these principles so that they have some level of awareness of them and understanding. Do you think we can do that in a better way?
I do, but here's the problem, or here's a problem. One of the points that the Choice book makes is that we have been encouraged, especially the better educated and more affluent among us, to have extremely high standards and not to settle for second best. Only the best will do. And I've never heard a parent say, I only want what's good enough for my children. And so even if we are not deliberately teaching our children that only the best will do, we are modeling that for them when we go about making decisions on their behalf. And one of the lessons in the book is that the pursuit of the best is at best a fool's errand, and at worst a recipe for misery. You can't find the best. There is no such thing as the best. And in a world of exploding choice, the only way even to begin to hunt for the best is to examine every possibility. So I think that parents can, and teachers can, provide a kind of education about how to make decisions for the kids that they teach or the kids that they're raising, but I think they aren't. And to the extent they are teaching their kids, they're probably teaching them the wrong lessons without intending to.
I think it's in practical wisdom that you give the example of a parent who uses the Talmud to kind of teach a lesson or thinking about the topic.
Yep.
And I've wondered about kind of our sacred stories and the degrees to which religion, through sacred stories, help to shape balanced perspectives on life that are often harder to come to on a completely rational basis. Has it become kind of a compelling value of a religious tradition?
I think it's a very important value of a religious tradition, and the way I would put it is that the thing about religious traditions, pretty much all of them as far as I know, is that what's most salient and prominent about them is that they have a moral dimension. It really is all about what's the right way to live, and that's what's absent from secular society. We have essentially regarded the answer to that question as a matter of individual choice. You have your values, I have mine. I can teach you how to think rationally so that you can achieve your values, but I can't teach you much about what values you should be trying to achieve. That's your business. And religious institutions are not shy about telling their members which values are worth pursuing and how to pursue them. And I think people desperately need moral anchors and moral guideposts, and the secular world is failing them.
Well, let's move on to practical wisdom. We're about halfway through the show, and this always happens. I mean, there's going to be more we want to talk about than we have time, but I really want to kind of segue into this next book, which just came out in December. That I posted in my blog post a link to the TED Talk, which there are actually two TED Talks that seem to address the themes of the book.
Yep.
But the most current TED Talk and those of you who would like can go and watch that as well. It's a nice short encapsulation. But you do address this question of institutions and morality, and come and through the book you use education as one of the primary examples of how we seem to be getting things wrong.
Yep.
So can I get you to talk a little bit about incentives, bonuses, sticks and carrots, that kind of stuff?
Sure. So the general theme of the book is that it's really very much an attempt to bring the thinking of Aristotle into the 21st century. And Aristotle was famously what's called a virtue theorist. He thought that the only way to have people living good lives and doing the right thing is by having good people. This is in contrast with people like, say, Kant, who thought that the trick to living good lives is to have the right rules and then have people follow those rules, the golden rule and various others. And for Aristotle, the key virtue, the one that was most important, was what he called practical wisdom. And this is what enabled you to determine when to be honest, when to be kind, how honest to be, when to be courageous, when to be cautious, when to persevere, and when to abandon a project. So there are all of these virtues that need to be exercised in moderation, and wisdom tells you how to exercise that moderation. And the argument we make in the book is that pretty much any situation that involves human beings interacting with other human beings demands this kind of wise judgment. Parents do know that they can't treat all their kids the same. Every kid is different and needs to be treated differently. School teachers know that they can't treat their kids the same. Doctors know that they can't treat their patients the same. Brutal honesty is the right path with some. Indirectness is the right path with others. Lawyers know they can't treat all their clients the same. Nonetheless, when we find ourselves dissatisfied with how our schools are working or our health clinics are working, the tools that we rely on are to come up with better rules or to introduce smart incentives. Either give people scripts to follow so that they will do the right thing, or make it worth their while to do the right thing. In the case of education, you have increasingly standardized curriculum, in some places scripted almost down to the level of individual sentences. And then you have big tests with all kinds of consequences attendant on how well kids do. You don't trust the judgment of teachers to figure out the right thing to do in this classroom with this set of kids, so you hand them scripts so that they don't need judgment. You don't trust that teachers will want to do the right thing. You sort of assume they're already burned out, so you incentivize them to do the right thing with prospects of big pay increases or bonuses. So those are the tools we have: sticks in the form of rules and carrots in the form of incentives. And the argument in the book is that neither rules nor incentives will get us what we really want and need from our teachers and our doctors and our lawyers. And worse, the more we rely on these things, the less wise our doctors, lawyers, and teachers will be, because they won't have a chance to practice using their judgment and treating each person as an individual, so they won't be any better at it after 5 years than they were on their first day. And that will only convince the people who are overseeing them that they don't have good judgment, and so you need more rules and more powerful incentives to get them to do the right thing. So there's a kind of vicious downward spiral. We don't have confidence in teachers and doctors. We stick them with rules and incentives, which gives us even less reason to have confidence in them, which leads to more rules and incentives, and the result is that patient care gets worse and education gets worse and pretty much everything gets worse. So that's the general theme of the book.
So those of you who are listening, if this is a theme that resonates with you, you're going to really enjoy practical wisdom. Enjoy may be the wrong word, but there are lots of descriptions about specific circumstances in which the environment for the educator is so counterproductive. And we'll get to kind of the solution piece in a minute. But before we do so,
the listeners know that we do end with a couple of chapters that provide, sort of really encouraging and optimistic counterexamples. So we're not doomed. There is a way out of this vicious cycle. I don't want people just, to slit their wrists when this hour is over.
You talk about how scripts and rules are well-intentioned, and they do, in some cases, help to prevent disasters from taking place.
Yep.
But that they're very good at also creating mediocrity, and people lose their morale, and the profession loses its morality. There's a sort of demoralizing that takes place. I didn't want to go to the solutions yet, so let's put that on hold for just a second.
Sure.
Adam Smith, de Tocqueville, those who participated in the founding of the United States, there was this sense that virtue was required for the other systems being worked on to work.
Yep.
How did they, was it just a difference in the culture and society at the time, or how did they introduce that idea into politics, free market economics?
Well, my take on that is that, Smith wrote this book called The Theory of Moral Sentiments, which he wrote before The Wealth of Nations, and is, I think, a better, more important book than The Wealth of Nations, which is where he invents the free market. And I think that he had 2 points to make. One is that markets won't work unless people are basically inclined not to take advantage of other people at every opportunity. That is to say, people are basically inclined to do the right thing. That's point one. And point two, people are naturally inclined to behave that way. And I think he was right about the first claim and wrong about the second claim. It isn't natural to be that way. What he was seeing was the way people behaved living in a society in which doing the right thing and following moral principles was a salient part of everybody's life. And what he didn't appreciate, and he couldn't have, is that what happens when markets start to exercise their bigger and bigger influence is that they corrode these moral commitments that he just took for granted as natural. And so when he was writing, it made perfectly good sense to think people are just not inclined to take every possible advantage of one another. But 200 years later, thanks to 200 years of corrosive market activity, people were inclined, or more people were inclined, to take every advantage that they could of one another. So no attention was paid to preserving the values that the market needed to function efficiently, and over time they eroded. So that's my take on Smith. And of course it was possible to talk about that at a time when A, society was more religious, and B, it was much more homogeneous. You could just assume that everybody had the same values back then, and the only people who counted, right, were English Protestants or Scottish Protestants. No one else counted. Those days are gone. Living in a very pluralistic society like ours, it's unnerving to get up on a soapbox and proclaim the values that everybody shares. And so people have become much sort of more self-conscious about talking in that way in public.
But to what degree did the factory model and the systemization science play into this? And can we recognize that in some ways as being a form of a cognitive trap as well?
I don't know if I think it's more of a motivational trap than a cognitive one. There was another assumption, which is that nobody wanted to work. People basically wanted to sit on their Barca lounge and watch soap operas all day. So the only reason anyone would ever do anything was for some kind of a payoff. And so the workplace got organized in a way that made the delivery of payoffs efficient and paid no attention to the qualities of the work itself, because the assumption was it didn't matter what the qualities of the work were. Nobody wanted to work it, whether there was no such thing as good work. So you organize work so that it's maximally efficient without worrying about whether people can get any meaning or satisfaction out of what they do. So that's the modern factory system that got created on the assumption that All you want to do is get people to produce as much as they possibly can in a unit of time, and the way to do that is by organizing work efficiently without worrying about about satisfaction. And that is certainly something that has been passed on from generation to generation, although I think nowadays the knowledge class has really changed that model, although it only affects the most elite stratum of modern society.
Well, I've wondered about that because Dan Pink came on the show to talk about his book Drive.
Yep.
And he echoes Douglas McGregor and the Theory Why kind of material. And we've known for a long time that for knowledge work, financial incentives actually produce the opposite.
Yep.
But it doesn't feel as though that lesson was learned well enough to avoid the financial crash. The financial industry was very much working on this assumption that you provide financial incentives that would produce better outcomes when in fact it was producing worse. So can we actually recognize that and change it if in fact over 25, 30 years in the business world it really hasn't become the predominant narrative?
I don't understand. Look, this is a mystery to me. I think that Pink's book summarizes stuff that has been out there for people to learn about and take seriously for a long time. But the dominant narrative in American life is not that one, and I don't know what it's going to take to take down the dominant narrative, to at least allow for there being a kind of plurality of narratives. Yes, it was, the financial collapse was partly the result of this notion that the only thing people care about is, in this case, the bankers, is money, and the trick is to engineer their work environment so that more the shareholders benefit, the more they benefit. And it led to this complete disaster. And the assumptions that all regulation does is get in the way of imaginative entrepreneurial spirit. So let's take the regulations away and trust that competition will give us the right kinds of financial institutions. I mean, I think only a crazy person would have believed that in advance, and yet it seemed as though all kinds of people who actually had power over the shape of our regulations did believe it and killed all kinds of regulations that would have prevented this downturn from turning into a calamity that it did. So I don't understand, I really don't understand how you start to attack the dominant narrative, because the evidence, as I say, has been there for years, and it is just virtually ignored by almost everybody.
Well, so let's move, because I want to make sure there's time for Q&A. Let's move to the solutions. And for me, one of the phrases in the book that really stood out, it may have been in the book or it may have been in one of the videos, but you said a wise person is made, not born.
Yes.
And I love that from the perspective of how we think about education. But if you're an educator and you're in an institution that's prescribing your behavior, what kinds of things have you seen where you felt like they were able to make a difference?
Well, so there are two kinds of responses that we talk about. One of them, I think, may give you a little bit of a lifeline if you're an educator, but I don't see how it can sustain itself. We talk about people who are, quote, canny outlaws. They do what they're told, but they find a way to do what they're told efficiently, and they squirrel away time so that they can also teach the way they think teaching should be done. So they're basically doing parallel tracks. They're teaching to the test, and then, sort of out of the corner of their mouth, they're saying, now let's do some real teaching and learning. Kids, we'll whiz through the teach for the test stuff, and then in these 2 hours I'll teach you economics the way it should be taught, or physics the way it should be taught, and so on. I have incredible admiration for people who behave in this way because they get no support from anybody, but I don't see how people can do it indefinitely. Eventually they burn out, they're going to leave, they're going to get caught. So I don't think this is a recipe for transforming the institutions. I think I think that you also need people who we call system changers. Okay.
So we're back on sound, and you were talking about chartered schools.
Yeah, I think charter schools are an example of a way you can create an alternative institutional structure within the context of a large urban school system that can provide an example of a different way of doing things that works. What I don't know is whether once you've identified particular charter schools that really do seem to be producing remarkable results, it's possible to scale that up so that they become the way the whole system works. I myself am incredibly impressed with KIPP schools, which I know a little bit about, and I think they're amazing, but I don't know that we could ask teachers in general to work million-hour weeks the way KIPP teachers do. It takes incredible dedication. There's a kind of commitment to the mission that KIPP teachers seem to have, and I don't even know if it'll be sustained among them. The first generation is full of enthusiasm, the next generation maybe less so. So I'm not confident that the best performing charter schools that I know about that exist now are actually models that can become the sort of standard issue of education going forward. But I think that's really the only hope. I think there are limits to what people can do as individuals, and eventually they're going to give up. And the trick is to come up with alternative institutions. We talk about how there's a pilot program at Harvard for training doctors that's based on an entirely different model of what doctors need to learn and how they best learn it. And is producing remarkable results. Incredibly empathetic, sensitive physicians who really have a sense of what patient care requires. Can this become the model for medical education in general? That remains to be seen.
So I came to a different conclusion.
Yeah.
I talked over you, so please finish if you'd like.
No, go ahead.
Well, I came to an interestingly different conclusion. KIPP school isn't my favorite model of alternative education. More in line with the medical school model, I would look at things like Big Picture Schools or the Coalition for Essential Schools, a variety of other sort of more democratic school environments. But again, interestingly enough, they don't become the main narrative, even with great success. They don't seem to inform the center. They sort of live on the fringes. Mm-hmm. And at this point, having read Paradox of Choice, being largely through practical wisdom, I'm feeling a little discouraged. Right? It's like, okay, so this is really going to happen. And then I got to this part where you talk about Seligman, Martin Seligman.
Yep.
I don't know if I'm saying his name correctly, and his authentic happiness.
Yep. And
it goes into this idea that promoting a person's peculiar strengths, EW's signature strengths, promoted authentic happiness. And I actually at this point have multiple stars in the book. As it goes to talk about Amy, you're going to have to say her last name for me.
Wisniewski?
Yeah.
Yeah, you mean work as a calling?
Right. Yeah, on work as a calling. And I got to this place of we are intriguingly recognizing that if we don't provide students with the ability to work on the things that interest them within structured boundaries, that we're really putting them at a disadvantage. And maybe that movement, what's alternately called the strengths movement, or kind of the sense of long-tail education, that movement, intriguingly, maybe more than the more visible kind of large reform movement holds the promise of reshaping what actually takes place in schools?
Well, look, you may be right. I think that's to me that's a plausible scenario for educating the kids I am least worried about. The kids who grow up, sort of surrounded by the valuing of education in the midst of privilege, but are disaffected by the experiences they have in school. I think long tail, let kids develop what they're excited about, may actually be liberating for kids like this, because these kids are going to kind of learn the basic stuff you need to learn to be a citizen of the world by accident. They just won't help but learn it because they're surrounded by it. These are the kids who are read to for an hour a day, every day when they're growing up, and they can survive without the kind of structured and disciplined curriculum that the KIPP schools insist on. I'm much less sanguine that this approach is the approach that's going to work for the majority of the kids we have to educate, where we can't take it for granted that they're just going to soak up stuff that they need to know, so that we can let them indulge what they're really passionate about and let the other stuff take care of itself. It won't take care of itself. So you may be right that this is a terrific model, and you may even be right that it's a terrific model that works for most kids. But I have this residual concern that it will work for some kids and be a disaster for others. Years and years ago, my graduate advisor moved into West Philadelphia near Penn, where he taught, and the folks who lived there, which was a mixture of Penn faculty members and mostly African American working class people, started a school. I mean, it was the Penn faculty were the impetus behind it, but it was a school that was meant to serve the community and not just the kids of Penn faculty. And it turned out that there was this massive and irresolvable dispute between the Penn faculty parents and the African American parents. The Penn faculty parents wanted their kids' interests to be indulged, relatively unstructured, let them do what turns them on. And the African American parents wanted to make sure their kids could read and write and add and subtract. The African American parents wanted the teachers walking around with rulers to smack kids upside the head when they weren't doing what they were supposed to do. And the Penn faculty parents wanted teachers to basically turn it into a sandbox. And I think this was an accurate reflection of the actual disparate needs of these two different communities. And I'm not sure there was a way to resolve this disagreement. And I think that captures what my concern is about what the future of education that you're so enthusiastic about. The right thing for some people, a disaster for some people. That's my worry anyway.
A really good, thoughtful response to that. I really appreciate it. Okay, so we are a little bit later starting with the Q&A than I would have wanted. I apologize. But this has been a great discussion, and again, I highly recommend both books. I haven't, because I am traveling, I'm not on my normal computer, and it's been hard for me to follow the chat on the smaller screen. I'm hoping that if you have put a question in the chat that you would like Barry to address, and that you would put it in again. Or feel free to use the icon at the bottom of your participant window, which is a hand with the green up arrow, to raise your hand and ask a question. If there are any questions for Barry, please feel free to put them in there. While we're waiting here, Barry, my daughter is going to spend the next year working with a humanitarian organization. She's 18, doing work in Nepal. And I talked to one of the board members of the organization, and he said, we were talking about funding, and there's sort of a constant difficulty in getting funding for their program. And I said, well, aren't there a lot of organizations out there now who are providing funding for these kinds of humanitarian activities? And he said, yes, but they measure all the wrong things. the metrics that they need to show progress are not actually the metrics that are the valuable ones for the villages that they help.
Uh-huh.
To what degree are some of the expectations that we have for education and in other areas in our lives sort of being driven by the wrong metrics because of our focus on finances?
I think hugely, but I don't even think it's just finances. I think it's something even more pervasive than that, and that is there is this temptation to measure what is easy to measure and pretend that it's important, instead of trying to measure what's important and living with the error in the measurement. To me, for example, we measure society-wide, we measure GDP because that's a relatively straightforward thing to measure. We don't measure well-being because we don't know how to measure it. Now, we act as if GDP is a good proxy for well-being. The richer a country is, the better off its citizens are. Well, that's true to a first approximation, but it certainly is not true enough that you should just do everything you can to increase GDP and not worry about whether people are living better lives. And I think the same thing is true when it comes to humanitarian organizations. And the Gates Foundation, the sense I have, has had a major impact here. They don't want to give you money unless that you've shown them that you're going to be measuring the result of what you do and thus can present evidence that it was effective. And ease of measurement and measurement of what's important do not always line up. So it seems to me perfectly plausible. But I don't think it's because we're so money-driven. I think it's because we're driven to be as objective as possible, as quantitative as possible, and we'll just latch on to anything that we can quantify easily.
Eric, you've raised your hand. I've given you the microphone. To turn your mic on, you click on the larger microphone button at the lower left of your screen. But I'm actually seeing an indicator here in the Eliminate session that makes it look like you might be having an audio issue. So if that doesn't work, please feel free to put your question in the chat. Again, draw a question for Barry. Please feel free to put it in the chat or to raise your hand, and Derek will let you come in as soon as you catch up on the audio. Barry, what about liberal arts colleges? And please feel free to put it in the chat or to raise your hand, and Derek will let you come in as soon as you catch up on the audio. Barry, what about liberal arts colleges? And when I went to school, I graduated. That's Derek.
Hello?
Okay, go ahead and put your mic back on, Derek. Yep.
Can you hear me?
That's Derek. You can. Go ahead and put your mic back on, Derek. Yep.
Okay. I had a question about boarding schools and how you feel about their viability in education today. I know that they are more resource intensive because you have to actually have the kids at the school as opposed to going home at night to their parents and families. But I was wondering if we took lower socioeconomic status children and put them in boarding schools, if that would maybe close some of the gaps that we see across the nation and really across the world. What are your thoughts on boarding schools?
Well, I got to be honest with you. I haven't given it a lot of thought until you asked the question. It's a great question. I think it's perfectly plausible that would have a big impact. I think that you'd probably hear a kind of political objection that what you were basically doing was educating people by destroying their ties to whatever culture they were coming out of. Right, you're substituting the culture of, let us say, white privilege for the culture, for whatever is their indigenous culture. And there might be a fair amount of resentment of that, even if the result was that there were bigger, there was more educational progress per year. But I think there's a less dramatic step that could be taken that would also have a big effect, and that is to have the school year basically run essentially all year. There's this evidence that what's called the summer melt is massive among inner city kids. And the reason is that almost nothing happens in their lives in between the end of one school year and the beginning of the next to reinforce the stuff they learned the year before. whereas, affluent, mostly white kids are getting these lessons elaborated and stamped in by accident in their normal day-to-day activities in their families. So if kids went to school 11 months a year, I'll bet you that a significant chunk of the gap between inner city, poor and rich schools would be reduced. And that doesn't require sending kids away.
So you're not able to see the chat, Barry, but fast and curious and very interesting. And Lisa brings up sort of the nuance of if school isn't so great, why is more school a solution? And I guess for piggybacking on that, could there be unintended consequences to that? Meaning, are there ways in which that would displace sort of the importance of families and helping families to do a better job themselves?
Well, you're not taking kids away from their families. They're just going to school for the school day. And Lisa makes a very good point. If school isn't so good, why is more school better? And I got to say, that's a very good point. But if that's what it takes, given that you can't transform the schools tomorrow, if having kids go to school for 11 months a year instead of 9 means that they're actually going to reach grade level in reading and math, or more of them will reach grade level, then I think you settle for what you can achieve now and worry about actually creating good schools tomorrow.
Okay, well, we're going to have to stop there. We're at the top of the hour, which means that for you, Barry, it's now 9 o'clock. And we do make a commitment to letting you get out right at the hour. Thank you so much for coming on. I'm clapping. You can't see that because it's a virtual.
It was really a pleasure. I hope the folks who are listening in found something useful in it.
Yeah, there's a lot of clapping going on, and you're just not able to see it, but take my word for it. Thank you for coming on. The books are The Paradox of Choice, Practical Wisdom, by Practical. Oops, acting up. The books are Paradox of Choice and Practical Wisdom, both fascinating books. The new one, Practical Wisdom, I hope you'll consider picking up. Great material on education. Coming up next week, Hugh McGuire on LibriVox, Pam Moran and Iris Hokal and Dale Stevens on College. Barry, thank you again. Have a great night.
Thank you. You too. Bye, everybody.
Thanks, folks, for joining in. Sure appreciate it. Thanks for